Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Ursula mentioned, this is actually the second time that I present the public opinion polling of the German Marshall Fund called the Transatlantic Trends in Houston. 1 year ago, I was invited by the World Affairs Council, and I think I had an audience of over 200 people. And since then, I'm telling my friends in Washington, D.C., that if they want to find people who are interested in transatlantic relations, they have to come to Texas. And this seems to be the case this year as well. And thank you so much for showing up in such great numbers. It's really good to get out from the Beltway and sort of talk about transatlantic relations outside of the D.C., New York area. So what I'm going to talk about is public opinion in the European Union, in Turkey, and in the United States. And our project, the German Marshall Fund, in cooperation with Compagnia di San Paolo and the Luso-American Foundation, Fundación BBVA, the Comunitas Foundation, and the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a truly transatlantic group of partners. We have been polling the United States and Europe for 10 years. This is actually our 10th anniversary of public opinion polling. Every year we survey a random sample of 1,000 people. In this year, we polled, in 2011, we polled in the United States, in Turkey, and in 12 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, the United Kingdom, Portugal, Slovakia, Spain, Bulgaria, Romania, and Sweden. So I don't want to give the impression that this is the EU 27, but we feel that based on the resources we have, this is a really good sample of old and new Europe, one of the bigger countries, one of the smaller countries. So whenever I refer to the European Union, I mean the countries of these 12 countries where we poll. This year we polled between May 25th and June 17th. And I broke down my presentation into 3 sections. First, I'm going to talk about transatlantic relations in general after George W. Bush. And then I'm going to talk about transatlantic divisions and transatlantic similarities in public opinion. And finally, I will talk about something that I think directs us to the future, about how Americans and Europeans see the world, and especially how their focus on Asia is. So first, one of our long-standing trending question for transatlantic trends is we ask our respondents whether they approve or disapprove the U.S. president handling of international policies. So this is really a specifically targeted question about foreign policies. It's different from the Gallup question, whether you approve or disapprove President Obama. And what you can see here is that presidential approval was in Europe was fairly low during the presidency of George W. Bush. And as you can see, in 2009, there was a big change. You don't have to be a statistician to see that this is a statistically significant increase in presidential approval, not just in the European Union, but also in Turkey, as well as in the United States. So this is our presidential approval in 2009. But in 2009, we were in the field very early on into Obama's presidency. So we were really interested in seeing whether this incredibly high level of enthusiasm towards Obama will last. And what we saw last year and this year is that even though his popularity is dipping somewhat within the European Union, he is still a very popular president in Europe. As you can see, his approval rate in the European Union is at 75%, and I think this is less than 83%, but I think he would be very happy to have that kind of approval rate in the United States. The only country where his approval rate did drop dramatically was Turkey. In 2009, his approval was at 50%, and then by the next year and this year, it's at the 28-30% level, which is a lot less than the Europeans gave him. Now, this is actually a very busy slide, but I wanted to show you the Obama approval broken down by the countries where we polled. And I think what's important here, the big picture, is that he mainly lost his popularity in countries where his popularity was so high that nobody really believed that you can maintain an approval rate of 92% that he had in Germany, that anyone can maintain something like 90% in Portugal or 90% in the Netherlands. So he's been actually losing his popularity in one of those countries, but I would call this sort of coming down to earth, becoming more normal, normal than what it was in the first year of his presidency. I think what's also important to see that in comparison to Western Europe, his popularity actually lagged behind in Central and Eastern Europe. And what you can see here is that he actually, throughout the past 3 years, he actually increased his popularity in some of the Central and Eastern European countries, most notably in Romania and Poland. Poland was a country that he visited earlier this year. But when we asked our respondents to give us an approval of how Obama is handling certain specific foreign policies. So the first question is whether you approve or disapprove Obama handling international policies in general. And then we asked a list of items about specific foreign policies. What you see here is that, with one exception, his approval rate for specific foreign policies is much lower than his overall approval rate. So in the European Union, only about half, at 51%, approve of his handling the situation in Libya, stabilizing Afghanistan, somewhat more, 58%, approve of his managing relations with Russia. And finally, this year, actually, the big success story, and we were in the field a couple of weeks after the killing of Osama bin Laden, which apparently affected his approval, but 73%, a very high percentage of the Europeans approved of his fighting of international terrorism this year. It's a major increase over last year, when I think it was 45%. Now, why is it important, right? Everyone knows that Obama, even as a presidential hopeful, was very popular in Europe. When he came to some European capitals, he was treated like a rock star. It's really something that we already knew. But why is this important? It's important because what we noticed throughout our polling is that presidential approval and desirability for U.S. leadership tend to go hand in hand. So what you see here is the data that the blue line represents whether the respondents feel that strong U.S. leadership in world affairs is desirable or not. And then the red line represents the percentage of those people who approved of the U.S. president. So as you can see, in 2009, when presidential approval skyrocketed, the percentage of those Europeans who wished strong American leadership also increased. It increased to 55%, and it's fairly stable at 54% this year, even though Obama's popularity has been declining a little bit. I think what's important here is that even though there was an incredible bounce in presidential approval in Europe, the desirability of U.S. leadership didn't skyrocket as much as the American president approval went up. So, for example, the largest number we had was right after 9/11 in 2002, when 64% of the Europeans wanted to see a strong U.S. leadership in world affairs. The next section, I'm going to talk about some of the transatlantic divisions and similarities that I think are very important for us to remember and see how the transatlantic community works through some of the differences and sometimes doesn't really work through some of the differences. But one of the big differences between Americans and Europeans is with regard to the use of force. When we ask our respondents whether war is sometimes necessary to obtain justice, here you see a very significant transatlantic divide. The majority of Americans, at 75%, feel that war is sometimes necessary to obtain justice. At the same time, only about 33% of the Europeans feel that. And this is something that we have known through other surveys, including Pew or the Eurobarometer, that Europeans tend to be pacifist in their approach to the use of force, whereas Americans are much more likely to say that war is necessary sometimes. Now, even though we have this almost, as Phil Gordon said, it's sort of a philosophical difference between Europeans and Americans, how they look at the use of force. Even though you have that philosophical difference between Europeans and Americans, the public opinion on certain foreign policy challenges are actually remarkably similar within the United States and in the European Union. This year, for example, more similar than ever on the topic of Afghanistan. This year, for the first time, we found that Americans, the majority majority of Americans, just like Europeans, are actually very pessimistic about Afghanistan. As you can see, in 2009, 56% of the Americans were optimistic about the situation in Afghanistan. Last year, 51%, and this year, only 41%. And related to this, the percentage of those Americans who would like to see U.S. troops to be withdrawn or reduced from Afghanistan also increased. Last year, we saw a big difference between Americans and Europeans. 64% of the Europeans wanted to see their troops reduced or withdrawn. Only 41% of the Americans. By this year, in a matter of 1 year, this transatlantic gap completely disappeared, and 66% of the Americans, as well as those in the European Union, would like to see their troops reduced or withdrawn. There's a lot of talk about NATO, and our trending question about the NATO, we ask our respondents whether they feel NATO is still essential for their country's security. And this year, we were particularly interested in seeing the results of this question after outgoing Secretary of Defense Gates had some, well, not very positive remarks about the future of NATO and the Europeans' commitment to finance NATO. But what we see here is that actually there is a very stable and very similar transatlantic support for NATO. 62% of the Americans, as well as those in the European Union, feel that NATO is still essential for their country's security. I think this is a very important finding, and I think for all of those people who work in relation to and together with NATO, it should be used as something that is very powerful still in the European mindset as well as in the United States. The only country that's an exception is Turkey. As you see, only a minority of the Turks feel that NATO is essential for their country's security. Another question that, especially with relation to the Gates speech, we were interested in seeing how people look at the defense spending. And once again, Americans and Europeans look remarkably similar. When we ask whether their country should increase defense spending, keep defense spending at the current level, or decrease defense spending, we see that the plurality of Americans and the Europeans both feel that their country should keep defense spending at the current level. I mean, of course, we are talking about different amounts, but still, I think it's very remarkable that the same amount of Americans as Europeans would like to keep defense spending at the current level. And the second most popular option was to decrease defense spending, and the least popular option was to increase defense spending. Now, once again, even though we have these transatlantic differences, as I showed earlier, with regard to the use of force, for example, Americans and Europeans are remarkably similar in the policy options they would like to promote with regard to Libya. We asked our respondents how they feel about different policy options. And once again, what's surprising here is that there is not a transatlantic divide, that a strong majority, 77% of the Americans and 74% of the Europeans felt that their country should intervene to protect civilians. Strong majorities also felt that they should help to remove Gaddafi, and they should also send military advisors to assist the rebels who oppose Gaddafi. And once again, very, very similar numbers. Less popular, 49% of the Americans, 37% of the Europeans felt supported sending arms and military supplies to the rebels who opposed Gaddafi. And the least popular option, both in the United States and in the European Union, were sending ground troops to assist the rebels who opposed Gaddafi. So once again, there's actually a remarkable similarity between Americans and Europeans, and many people, including Phil Gordon, brought up the Libyan intervention as a success story of transatlantic cooperation, where actually the United States doesn't have to be in the lead to carry out a successful mission there. The final slide in this section is something that I think, once again, is very timely now. Perhaps not surprising, but I think it's interesting to see the numbers. Americans and Europeans, another point where they don't agree is the peace in the Middle East and who should they pressure with regard to solving the Arab-Israeli conflict. As you can see, the majority of Americans would like to see more pressure put on Palestinians, whereas the plurality of Europeans, at 38%, would like to put more pressure on Israel. And Turkey, the majority of Turks would like to put more pressure on Israel, and only 7% of the Turks would like to see more pressure on Palestine. So this is something that will stay with us for a while, the transatlantic division on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And for my final section, I think this is probably the most relevant to the topic of this conference. How do Americans and Europeans see the world and the emerging world powers? Once again, I think what's interesting is that in terms of favorability of other countries, Americans and Europeans actually have very similar world views. If you see, we ask a group of countries, and we ask our respondents in the United States whether they have favorable or unfavorable opinion of those countries. And as you can see here with the U.S. results, perhaps not surprisingly, 83% of the Americans have a favorable opinion of the United States. But 75% has favorable opinion of Japan, 65% of the Americans have favorable opinion of the European Union, and as you go down, the least favorable country was Pakistan. Only 18% of the Americans had favorable opinion of Pakistan. If you look at the data from the European Union, the pattern is really remarkably similar. 72% of the Europeans have favorable opinion of the United States, 68% had favorable opinion of Japan, 71% have favorable opinion of the European Union. And once again, the least favorable country was Pakistan. Only about 26% of the Europeans had favorable opinion of Pakistan. So by and large, Americans and Europeans, in terms of favorability, look at the world fairly similarly. The only country that drastically different was Turkey. Only about 30% of the Turks had favorable opinion of the United States, and not much more, nothing to be proud of. 39% of the Turks had favorable opinion of the European Union. But at the same time, over half of the Turks, 52%, have favorable opinion of Pakistan, a country that was very unpopular by both the Americans and the Europeans. One of the big questions that we at the German Marshall Fund, together with others, have been thinking about for a really long time is how is the rise of Asian powers going to affect the transatlantic relationship? Is this something that will push Europeans and Americans closer to each other, that they will realize that it's easier for them to compete with a country like China when they pool their resources, or is it something that will pull them apart? So this year we asked our respondents whether they think for their national interest, which one is more important. In the United States we asked whether it's the countries of the European Union or it's the countries of Asia. And in the European Union, we ask whether Asia is more important or the countries, or the United States is more important. And then here you see a really interesting transatlantic divide. 51%, the majority of Americans feel that Asia is more important than the countries of the European Union. This is a big change. In 2004, we asked which region is more important for U.S. vital interest, and the majority in 2004 in the United States said that the European Union is more important for U.S. vital interest. But at the same time, if you look at the European Union, it's the other way around. The 52%, the majority of Europeans feel that the United States is more important, and only about 37% feel that Asia is more important than the United States. Now, when we looked into the American data and we looked at our American respondents broken down by age groups, we found something really truly remarkable, that young Americans are much more likely to say that Asia is more important for their national interests than the countries of the European Union. The blue bar here shows the results from the United States. The red bar shows the results from the European Union. The only reason why I'm showing that is that you don't see a similar age difference, but in the United States it's very marked. 76% of those Americans who are between the ages of 18 to 24, 76% feel that Asia is more important. And for every subsequent age group, the percentage of those who feel that Asia is more important than the countries of the European Union goes down. And at the very end, only about a third of those aged 65 or older feel that Asia is more important than the European Union. So as you can see here, we didn't see a similar division based on age in Europe. What we found is that the country mattered a lot, and the Europeans themselves are also very divided, whether Asia or the United States is more important. On average, as I said, 52% of the Europeans feel that the US is more important. This was especially pronounced in Poland, the UK, Germany, and Romania, where 58 to 60% of the population felt that the United States is more important than Asia. But on the other side of the scale, the plurality of Turks at 44%, but the majority of the Swedes and the majority of the Spanish and half of the French felt that Asia is more important than the United States. So this is something that we are very interested in seeing, whether more countries in Europe will join the Asia is more important group, or more countries will join the United States is more important group. So I would like to finish here. But before I do that, I actually want to point out a couple of more slides about the perception of China in particular, not just general in Asia, but there's a transatlantic divide on how people look at China. The majority of Americans at 63% see China as an economic threat. This is actually more divisive within the European Union, but the plurality of Europeans see China more as an economic opportunity and not as an economic threat. With regard to China as a military threat, there's also a transatlantic divide. The plurality of Americans at 47% feel that China is a military threat, and this was only a minority view in the European Union. So finally, some of the conclusions of our polling. Obama's approval remained high in the European this year, but his specific policies are less popular, except for fighting international terrorism. We found a continuing transatlantic divide about the use of force, but we found convergence this year over optimism and the number of troops in Afghanistan, the role of NATO, defense spending, or specific policies with regard to Libya. We also found a notable transatlantic divide, whether it is the role of the European Union or the United States to help establish democracies in other countries, in that Americans are a lot less likely to say that it's the role of the United States to help promote democracy outside of the US. With regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict, a majority of Americans preferred putting more pressure on Palestinians, while the plurality in the European Union preferred putting more pressure on Israelis. And finally, I think the really surprising result in this year's poll was that the majority of Americans this year said that the countries of Asia were more important for US national interest than the countries of the European Union, and especially that younger Americans were more likely to say so. Thank you.